All right, let's just dive right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we are completely decoding the massively complex web of rules governing Indian workplaces. We're talking about a system that covers everything from your traditional heavy industry factory floors all the way out to the modern, hyper-fast digital gig economy. It's a massive, fascinating ecosystem, and we are going to break the whole thing down together.
And to really get it, we need to start right in the action. Think about the 2024 Samsung India strike. What honestly looked like a straightforward local factory dispute suddenly pulled in the state government, the police, and even the Union Labor Ministry. Why did that happen? Well, because in India, industrial conflict is almost never just a two-party matter. Workplace decisions here aren't just operational. They inevitably escalate into multi-party conflicts that pull in the state, capital, and collective labor. It's like a giant, interconnected puzzle.
This escalation happens because of a very core principle in Indian labor law. Employment is a continuing relationship, not just a single, isolated transaction. So, what does this actually mean for us? It means every single policy shift or managerial decision is always interpreted through the lens of prior experience. It heavily influences trust, fairness, and long-term legal risk. You literally cannot just focus on technical compliance. You have to balance relational legitimacy too, or else you're going to run into massive, massive friction.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, theoretical frameworks. Second, the historical evolution. Third, key actors. Fourth, the sweeping four labor codes. And finally, number 5, the gig economy frontier.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Theoretical Frameworks and Understanding Workplace Conflict.
When it comes to workplace dynamics, organizations usually view themselves in one of two distinct ways. First, you have the unitary perspective. This is the idea that a business is just one big, harmonious, integrated family. Everyone shares the exact same goals, and any conflict is just viewed as a weird aberration or maybe a communication breakdown. But then, on the flip side, we have the pluralistic perspective, which is much more realistic for large industries. This view accepts that organizations are naturally made up of divergent subgroups, like management on one side and unions on the other, with inherently different interests. Because this conflict is basically baked into the structure, it requires robust mediation. And this is actually the foundation of John Dunlop's famous systems model, where all these actors are bound together by an intricate web of rules.
Which perfectly brings us to Section 2, Historical Evolution. Let's look at how India evolved from colonial systems to modern competitiveness by building out that exact web of rules. Going back to the 19th century, we started with pure, unadulterated colonial exploitation. Workers were treated as commodities, enduring brutal 18-hour shifts. Fast forward to independence in 1947, and the state stepped in heavily. They created this paternalistic social pact where unions essentially promised industrial peace in exchange for state-guaranteed job security. But then, a massive pivot happened in 1991 with market liberalization. The national goal shifted overnight from industrial peace to global competitiveness, and that tilted the power balance heavily toward employers who desperately needed operational flexibility. And that wild ride leads us right to 2025 and 2026, where decades of incredibly complex laws are being totally consolidated into 4 massive new labor codes. Moving on to Section 3, Key Actors. Let's map the board and look at the massive organizations actually representing labor and capital. To even get recognized at the very top level as a central trade union organization, a union needs a minimum of 500,000 verified members spread across multiple states and industries. That is a massive scale. According to the verification data, organizations like the BMS and INTUC literally represent millions of workers. And if you look closely at their political affiliations, almost all of these giant federations are directly tied to major national political parties, whether that's the RSS, INC, or CPIM. So everyday labor relations in India are deeply intrinsically intertwined with national politics. You really can't separate the two. Down at the foundational level, a worker might organize in one of 3 main ways. They could group by shared skills in a craft union, or broadly across their entire sector in an industrial union, or they could organize directly alongside their colleagues under a single employer in an enterprise union. The absolute key takeaway here is that under the Trade Unions Act of 1926, any registered union becomes a distinct legal entity. This is huge. It means they can own property, open bank accounts, and sign legally binding contracts on behalf of all their workers. And honestly, this is where you see the brilliant balance of the whole system. Sitting on the other side of the bargaining table, we have employers' organizations, or EOs, groups like the AIOE, EFI, and SCOPE, representing both private and public sector enterprises.
Under that exact same 1926 Act, they hold the exact same legal status as trade unions. Their entire purpose is to balance the scales, defend the enterprises, and influence national labor policy at the highest tripartite levels.
Let's jump into Section 4, the 4 labor codes, and what we call the new rules of the game. Fast forward to November 2025, and the entire rulebook was dramatically rewritten.
One of the absolute biggest shifts in this massive reform, which somehow managed to consolidate 29 different central labor laws, comes down to a single number: 50%. This is the new 50% rule for wage calculation. In the past, employers could, structure salaries with a tiny basic wage and pile on massive allowances just to avoid paying high Social Security and Provident Fund contributions. Not anymore. Now, if those excluded allowances exceed half of an employee's total remuneration, that excess amount is retroactively factored right back into the statutory benefit calculation. It's an absolute game changer for corporate compliance and worker benefits.
Beyond just wages, the codes fundamentally restructure how workers actually get justice. Those localized district-level labor courts, completely abolished. Everything is now being channeled directly into reconstituted industrial tribunals. And these new tribunals sit as 2-member bunches. You have 1 judicial member and 1 administrative member. Now, critics have been quick to point out that this might severely overburden the system. It could make courts geographically and financially much harder to access for vulnerable individual workers. Plus, adding administrative members who don't necessarily have formal legal training has sparked intense debates about the true independence of these tribunals. The new codes also introduce us to another incredibly important number: 14. The framework around strikes and lockouts has become incredibly strict across literally all industries. Workers are now entirely prohibited from going on strike without providing a mandatory 14-day prior notice. Imagine being absolutely furious about a critical, life-threatening workplace safety issue, but you legally have to send a polite calendar invite 2 weeks in advance before you can strike. And if a strike happens during ongoing conciliation or tribunal proceedings, it's deemed entirely illegal. No exceptions. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the gig economy frontier, focusing on algorithms and precarity. Because while these new labor codes are trying desperately to organize the traditional factory floor, an entirely new digital economy has exploded right past them. If we analyze gig work, things like your everyday ride-hailing or food delivery apps, we can use the Job Demands Resources, or JDR framework. This model is so helpful because it shows exactly what happens when you combine incredibly high job demands, like strict, unforgiving delivery timelines and constant algorithmic monitoring, with extremely low resources, like zero operational autonomy or career progression. The end result? Severe psychological distress and intense physical fatigue for the worker. And the crazy thing is, in this space, workers aren't negotiating with a human HR manager. They are dealing entirely with an opaque algorithm under a system of algorithmic management. A few massive digital platforms hold what economists call oligopsonistic power. Basically, just a handful of digital buyers control the entire market for labor. This allows them to unilaterally dictate pricing, set targets, and exert total operational control. And because these gig workers are legally classified merely as independent contractors, they find themselves completely excluded from traditional statutory protections, like minimum wage floors. So where do they turn? Because millions of these gig and informal workers lack access to traditional courts or collective bargaining. They often have to rely on what scholars call shadow justice. While formal alternative dispute resolution is highly structured, legally binding, and supported by legal counsel, shadow justice is completely different. It relies on immediate, community-led conciliation by elders or local organizations. Sure, it's fast and it costs nothing, but it completely lacks legal transparency and structural power parity. And unfortunately, that often just perpetuates the existing inequalities for these informal workers. But this systemic precarity hasn't just gone unchallenged. It has sparked a totally new, highly energetic frontier of labor activism. Just look at the massive 2026 strikes, like the New Year's Eve strike in Bengaluru and the All India Breakdown strike in Telangana. Gig workers are banding together to protest unregulated algorithmic pricing, and they are demanding fair, transparent contracts from these massive digital platforms. They're basically forcing the system to acknowledge them. Trying to adapt to these wild technological shifts, the government actually drafted the Shram Shakti Nidhi 2025 policy. The goal here is to shift the Labor Ministry's role into more of an employment facilitator. The biggest, most ambitious proposal is creating a centralized digital labor stack. This would integrate worker identities and create a universal social security account. meaning benefits could literally follow a worker anywhere they go. However, trade unions have heavily criticized the policy. They are worried about its shift toward a duty-based framework, and they've raised major red flags over data privacy, the digital divide, and the sheer lack of formal tripartite consultation when the policy was being drafted.
All of which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought for this explainer. As India's massive labor governance system rapidly evolves from those old colonial factories into a fully digitized ecosystem, driven by massive data stacks and algorithmic management, who ultimately holds the real bargaining power? Is it the worker, the employer, or the algorithm? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me.